Years of time has come and gone since I first heard it told.
Vladimir Putin announced this week that Russia will begin using the Chinese yuan for international payments instead of the dollar. Saudi Arabia is also in talks with Beijing to do the same thing. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, they are in talks with Iran as well to consider an economic alliance with China and Russia. And they can even be joining the BRIC countries, which is an acronym for these countries here, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries all have emerging economies. So what happens if our economy and the U.S. dollar are no longer the world's dominant currency? Former Assistant Treasury Secretary and host of the Monica Crowley podcast, Monica Crowley, is here to weigh in. Monica, great to see you this morning. Let's start right there. What happens if these emerging economies move away from the U.S. dollar towards the Chinese yuan?
Well, good morning, Will. It's great to be with you. And it's really hard to overstate exactly how catastrophic the abandonment of the U.S. dollar would be as the world's global reserve currency. Look, since the end of World War II, the dollar has been the safe place to go, and it's been backed up by a couple of things. It originally was backed up by gold, but President Nixon took us off the gold standard, so there's no hard asset backing up the dollar anymore for the last 50 years. But also it's been backed up by the strength and economic power of the United States and the fact that oil has always been traded in dollars. If that were to end, that would mean the end of the U.S. dollar. Look, there is a perfect storm happening right now, Will. The world's reserve currency being that, having that status has been a real privilege, but we've abused the privilege by wholly reckless monetary and fiscal policies over many years, certainly over the last couple of years, which has really devalued the dollar. On top of that, now you do have this perfect storm of Biden's weakness, his war on American domestic energy production, the Ukraine war, and as you point out, because of all of these things, we've got America's enemies led by China forming a new economic bloc. And all it would take at this point now, because we're at this pivotal moment, Will, is for Saudi Arabia, who has indicated that they're open to this, to say, you know what, we're going to be open to considering other currencies to trade in oil. If that were to happen, there would be a complete implosion of the global economic system, but certainly the American economic system. And if that were to happen, you'd be looking at sky-high inflation, just raging Weimar Republic kind of inflation. If you think inflation is bad now, just wait. And if that were to happen, you'd be looking at sky-high inflation, just raging Weimar Republic kind of inflation. If you think inflation is bad now, just wait.
Signs of the times.
The Weimar Republic. So during World War I, Germany went and they went into various European countries. They stole all kinds of things like their art, they stole their gold, various things. They brought these things back to Germany. Finally, the Allied powers ganged up, they came back and they put a stop to this and they won the war. And then they wanted to punish Germany for their involvement in this war. And so Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. And what happened was they had to pay back nearly $270 billion in today's currency anyway, of gold-backed marks. And so you can imagine how difficult this was for Germany to have to deal with. Now, the basic idea was they were trying to spur on the economy in Europe again. And so what happened was, as they were shipping it over, they were shipping over gold, but people just weren't using it all that much. They were saving it because of the difficult times they were in. And finally, they got another idea. The idea was that they would take a gold-backed currency, and instead of sending gold over to these other countries, they would just send the marks, and instead of people just saving it up, then they began to spend it, and it began to spur on the economy. So they were shipping these gold-backed marks to these various countries, and then they began to think, after a couple of years, hey, nobody would really know if this money wasn't backed by gold. So what if we took it off the gold standard and just shipped off paper money to these people? They wouldn't know anyway. And so that's what they did. And before World War I, it was about 4 Reichsmarks to the American dollar at the time. So let's just say $1 for one chicken, well, it would be 4 Reichsmark for a chicken, just to give an idea of what it might be like. But very rapidly, because they were printing more money, it went from 4 marks to the dollar to 9 marks to the dollar. And by the time we get to July of 1919, it was 14 marks to the dollar. So the marks are becoming worth less and less over time. So the economists came up with a great idea. They realized, hey, if they're devaluing our currency by 60%, because it kept going down, 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 they thought, well, if they devalue it by that much, we'll just print that much more. And that's what they ended up doing. And by January of 1920, it was now 65 Reichsmarks to the dollar. So now at this point, the people were really beginning to feel the inflation. But the politicians, they themselves began to feel it also. So they came up with a great idea. They signed legislation so that every time there was a devaluation of the currency, they would get a raise. So they got to the point where they didn't have to worry about inflation at all. But keep in mind, that was only for the politicians. By January of 1922, the inflation had gone up to 190 Reichsmarks to the dollar. Now, at some point, they came up with an ingenious device that was on the cash registers. And what that was they began to realize inflation was going up so rapidly. They would put a device on the cash register that has been called the multiplier. That would, every time you would hear a click, it would raise the price of what was in your cart by 10%. Now, by July of 1922, it came to 460 Reichsmarks to the dollar. And when you were in the grocery store, every 30 seconds you would hear a click on that cash register, and that means everything you put in your cart went up by 10%. You can imagine this began to create a real buying frenzy, and you can see why serious inflation can be very detrimental to people's mental health, because people begin to constantly think about money because it begins to devalue over and over and over. By January of 1923, the price had now gone to 8,000 Reichsmarks to the dollar. And this really changed things in the factories. So the workers in the factories realized, hey, we can't get paid every 2 weeks. The cost is just skyrocketing. So they made an agreement that they would get paid every week. And you can imagine that was helpful, but it wasn't good enough because the inflation was going up so rapidly. So finally they made an agreement that they would get paid every single day. But like I said, it's going up every 30 seconds, 10%. Finally, they made a contract that they would get paid every single hour. And I've heard the story go that they would take every single hour of that money, they would run outside of the factory or the place that they were working, and they would give that money to their wife or whoever it was, and they would rush to the store to buy something before the prices went up. I mean, they were still going up on the way, obviously, at this point, but you can imagine the frenzied living experience that people must have been going through at the time. This began to create a serious problem for money printing. They got to the point where the most important job in the country, the most productive work in the country, was printing paper to produce all of these bills that were running. They had something like 16 mills running 24 hours a day, just printing off money, money, money. But then they got to the point where they were printing it so fast, there just wasn't enough time to print on both sides. And then once it was at least 10,000 marks to the dollar, it was no longer worth totally printing these, and so they just added stamps on top of the old bills. Now, by August of 1923, it was at 4.6 million marks to the dollar. And from what I understand, it was in that month that, you see, American economists from Harvard, I think there were 5 of them, who had been working to try to get the economy stimulated in Europe and helping out Germany to pay back their reparations. They basically said, okay, we're gonna head back home. You guys can take it from here. There wasn't much hope for the German economy at this point. By September of 1923, the price had gone up to 100 million to the dollar, and every 15 seconds, this is hard to believe, but every 15 seconds, the price would go up by 100%. I mean, you can understand why this is called hyperinflation. And by October of 1923, it was 25 billion Reichsmarks to the dollar, and it might be hard to believe that it could be inflating this bad. Finally, by November of 1923, the Reichsmark had gone from 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. and at this point it was worth nothing. It got to the point where it was totally useless. There was no point even using it. You probably heard the old story of somebody carrying down the road a wheelbarrow filled with Reichsmarks, and the wheelbarrow was worth more money than the cash that was filling that wheelbarrow. Kids would use it to play with. People started using it as scrap paper. It became utterly worthless. And this is what ends up happening at the end of a hyperinflationary period, as the idea goes that money becomes nothing.
But more importantly, we would lose our economic dominance and we would lose our superpower status.
Monica, the world's reserve currency, you said it's a privilege for the United States for the dollar to have been the world's currency. How does that relate to each individual American? How has that changed or impacted or improved our lives throughout the last several decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's given the United States incredible dominance in the world in terms of the economic system and in terms of trade. It's kept prices down. So whether it's energy prices, whether it's your food prices, the entire global economic system is reliant on the safe and secure dollar. But that is no longer true, again, because we've been printing money like crazy and devalued the power of the dollar and the value of the dollar. But on top of it now, again, oil is the critical linchpin of this. If Saudi Arabia decides to join with America's enemies here and start trading oil in different currencies, that is going to undermine the entire global economic system. And here at home, you know what it's going to mean for us? It's going to mean raging inflation, so much worse than anything we have ever experienced, Will. And I'll tell you, they're setting it up so that they can then come to the rescue by introducing central bank digital currency. If they were to do that, and the United States already has a pilot program, that means the loss of your individual economic freedom, because the government will have total access and control of everything you buy and sell and the ability to turn it off like that.
In the air, keep your eyes upon the eastern sky. Lift up your head, redemption draweth nigh. Signs of the times are everywhere. There's a bright